What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, and on this episode, I got a couple things I want to get to with this episode. Towards the end, as always, we'll get to your comments, your thoughts from this past week in the PLL. This week, more of a mailbag situation. I asked for anything and everything that you guys wanted me to get to on this episode, so I'll answer some of those near the end of the episode. Segment 2, we're going to talk about the team that is most likely to miss the postseason in PLL this year. But in segment 1, I want to start out the show kind of the opposite of segment 2 as to who will get the number 1 seed when we hit playoff time in the Premier Lacrosse League. So there's currently 3 teams at 4-2 overall. That's the Redwoods, Atlas, and the Whipsnakes. The Water Dogs are 4-3 to kind of be meshed into that group. So out of those, who gets the number 1 seed? I mean, at the same time, it could still be a team like the Archers could be in play at 3-3, especially with their plus 22 score differential so far this year. So if they can put together a couple more wins here on the regular season with that score differential that they have, they aren't out of the discussion, I think, for that number 1 spot. But out of those 5, the question I think really that needs to be asked is who's looked the best so far out of that group. I mean, you look at Monday's episode with the power rankings that we did. I had the Redwoods 1, Atlas 2, Water Dogs 3, Whipsnakes 4, and Archers 5. So when you kind of go down that line, the Redwoods are at 1, mostly because they beat the Whipsnakes, and the Archers in that same weekend lost in week 5 to the Cannons, so that really helped them out as well. The Atlas are 3rd in the PLL rankings, even though I think they should be 2nd because the Water Dogs occupy that 2nd spot. But while they've played well as of late, they're, I think, still in some ways being haunted by their beat down in week 1 against the Archers in the form of their score differential. If you take that game away in week 1, their score differential would actually be much, much higher than what it is. So like I said, in a way, they're still kind of being haunted to this very day by that game against the Archers in week 1. The Water Dogs, I think, were the biggest movers from week 4 to week 5 in the power rankings on Monday's episode after going 2-0 in week 5. That was a big weekend for that Water Dogs team, and they won both those games, I think, pretty convincingly. I didn't watch much of the game on Sunday that they were a part of, but from what I could tell, they won both those games pretty easily. And the offense, I think, applied a lot of pressure to the opposing defenses last weekend, and Withers was able to have some success at the faceoff stripe. But I think most importantly of all, the defense and Dylan Ward showed a pulse in week 5 and really played 2 of their better games of the entire season in one weekend. And that to me was a big reason why they were able to go 2-0 in week 5 and really seemingly turn their season completely around. So I don't think we've seen the Whipsnakes this low. When you talk about a team like the Whipsnakes, I don't think we've seen them this low in the standings since dating back to 2019. And while I think they should be higher because of, like I said, the Water Dogs being spotted at number 2, which I don't think necessarily should be the case, but the Whipsnakes haven't looked like the best team in the league the last 3 weeks. And I mean, yes, they've had their injuries. We've talked about that before. Guys like Matt Rambo still out with injuries. Zed missed a game or 2 because of injuries, things like that. But when you look at it, the rest of the team the rest of the league has dealt with injuries throughout much of the season, and many of them have still found ways to win. I mean, you look at the Chrome. The Chrome knocked off back-to-back number 1 teams at one point or another, and one of them, yes, was the Whipsnakes when they've had injuries to start the year. A team like the Atlas loses Jack Kincannon, and they go out in week 5 and beat the Chaos with their backup goalie in JD Colarusso, and he had a hell of a game that night. So, I mean, it is possible, even with some guys being injured, even if it's more of key guys for your team, it is still possible to win games in this league. And that's just something the Whipsnakes haven't really been able to do these last 3 weeks or so. And the Archers have fallen off since their 3-0 start as well, coming into these past couple weeks, now losing their last 3 straight, each by a goal each. And I think that I said this on Monday's episode, they've sort of fallen into that same trap that the Cannons found themselves in the previous couple weeks, where they were in most of those games, but they just weren't able to make that one or two extra plays to make that score in their favor, where they were losing each of those games by 1 goal each. And I think when you look at the Archers, they're one of those teams that they have what it takes to make it out of this slump. They have the offense to be able to score them enough goals to win just about any game. That's why they have the score differential that they do. The defense, I think, will be solid in front of Adam Gittleman, who I think at this point in the season, given where their record is, given where the standings are, and being in the last 2 weeks of the regular season before playoff time, Chris Bates really needs to have Adam Gittleman in the cage from now on. He can't do any more of this, okay, I'll play Adams for a half and I'll play Gittleman for a half, or I'll sit Gittleman for a random game in week 4 or whatever it was. Like, he needs to have Gittleman out there as much as possible. I know that for a lot of teams, like I said, in this league, injuries have been a problem, but you gotta go with the guys that you know are going to win you games, and Gittleman is one of those guys that he will give you more than enough opportunity to win games down the stretch. So now you have to kind of consider, what do these teams' remaining schedules look like these last 2 weeks of the regular season. I'll also provide my prediction as to how these teams will finish it out in their last couple games. But the Redwoods have the Archers in week 7, then the Whipsnakes and Chaos in week 8. Realistically, I could see them going 2-1 here. I also don't think that 3-0 is totally unlikely either, given that they've already beaten a team like the Whipsnakes this year. But I definitely think 2-1 is going to be realistic for them, whether they lose to the Archers or the Whipsnakes. I think for me, if I had to guess, I would say that the Whipsnakes will get their revenge on the Redwoods in that week 8 matchup, because again, that's a game where it's crunch time in the PLL. It's week 8, last week of the regular season. Every win matters. So I think that that's a game that we're used to seeing a team like the Whipsnakes be able to pull out. So again, I think that for the Redwoods, probably 2-1 is realistic for them in their last 3 games. The Atlas have Chrome and Cannons in week 7 and the Water Dogs in week 8. And I think whether Jack Kincannon plays or not, we saw in week 5 that the defense is legit in front of whoever's going to be in the cage. And I think JD Colarusso showed that he is more than capable at playing at a Jack Kincannon level of production, because I said on Monday, I don't think that he played any worse in that game than Jack Kincannon would have, and that really made me feel good about their ability to win these last couple games. So I have the Atlas going 3-0. Could they realistically lose a game or two in this stretch? Yeah, because you look at a team like the Cannons, maybe they turn some things around after the win over the Archers. Maybe the Water Dogs are now starting to catch fire a little bit since they went 2-0 last weekend as well. So could they lose a game or two in these last 3? Yeah, but I think from what we know right now, I think it's easy to say that they could realistically go 3-0. The Water Dogs have Whipsnakes in week 7 and Atlas in week 8. This is tricky because you're not really sure what to make of them after week 5, because going into week 5, they were one of the lower teams in my power rankings prior to week 5. I believe they were even last in my power rankings. Then they go out and make it look easy against their 2 opponents in week 5. So they're a tough team, and I've said this almost the entire season. They're a tough team for me to be able to read and really get a gauge on. So the Water Dogs could either go 2-0 in these games, or they could go 0-2. We just don't know, and I think that that's kind of represents this league as a whole in 2021, is we never know what's going to happen. From a game-to-game basis, from team to team, you never know what's going to happen. So like I said, Water Dogs could either go 2-0 or they could go 0-2. We don't know. But the Whipsnakes have the Water Dogs in week 7, then Redwoods and Archers in week 8. And again, like I said before with the Whipsnakes, talking about that Redwoods rematch in week 8, is these are the kinds of games where the Whipsnakes really show up. Again, I know they've got injuries to guys like Matt Rambo, but this is where they start to play that championship level lacrosse where their schedule doesn't seem easy these last couple games, but I wouldn't be surprised if they found ways to win. Like I said a couple weeks ago, they win in Whipsnakes fashion, that late game, late situation when a play needs to be made, somebody ends up making it, and they win either in the final seconds or in overtime. And this is that part of the season where we really start to see them play that kind of lacrosse, where when the game is on the line, you can bet that a team like the Whipsnakes are going to go out and make a play. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if in those last 3 games, again, Water Dogs, Redwoods, and Archers to finish out their regular season, I wouldn't be all that surprised if they went 3-0, because that's just kind of who we know that they are and who they can be. The Archers have the Redwoods in week 7, then Chaos and Whipsnakes in week 8. Here, I'm going to go 1-2 for the Archers, but again, I think it's one of those things where they could go 1-2, they could go 0-3, they could go 3-0. We just don't know. But if I had to guess, if I had to offer you a guess right here, right now, I'm going to go with 1-2 for the Archers. So who in this situation, if all this kind of plays out, who in this situation gets the number 1 seed? If I'm doing the math correctly, it should be between the Atlas and the Whipsnakes to see who has the better score differential. And it's worth noting here that at this very moment, heading into the All-Star break, the Atlas have the advantage in score differential. Both teams are currently 4-2, but the Atlas have the score differential advantage at +3, while the Whipsnakes are -1. So they have a 4-goal score differential up on the Whipsnakes, and I think that's something that these last couple games, even if the Atlas only win 1 or 2 of them, that score differential is going to be a big piece to the puzzle for seeing who gets that number 1 seed in the postseason. But I got some comments from you guys on some of these topics. At Stevie Mac Media is the Twitter handle. You can hit me up there for all PLL related topics and discussion. Coach Shrek on Twitter says, as much as I hate to feed your ego, I can't see Atlas losing any of their remaining games and therefore finishing the season first overall. Yeah, like I said, it's one of those things where they could either go 0-3 or 3-0. That's just how this league has been this year. We never know. But I think, like I said, from what we know of these teams so far and the direction that a team like the Atlas are trending in, where they seemingly get a little bit better each and every game, each and every week, it's not that crazy to suggest that the Atlas could go 3-0 in these last 3 games and really be putting themselves in that position to get that number 1 seed. And if it comes down to score differential, there aren't very many teams in the league that currently have a better score differential than them. And really it would come down to a team like the Archers maybe winning a couple games down the stretch and then running away with it because nobody's going to catch their score differential, obviously. But yeah, I don't think it's crazy to think that the Atlas could have a legitimate shot at it, given where they currently stand in the standings, what their remaining schedule looks like, and the fact that if they win a couple games, they'll be able to improve on their score differential while doing it. But like I said, keep in mind that with this league, you just never know. So it's really hard to judge something like this, but I think that it's still fun to talk about nonetheless, because I could end up being completely wrong about all of this 2 weeks from now when the regular season wraps up, 2 or 3 weeks from now. But again, it's just something interesting to talk about and kind of work through, like we did with that Lyle Thompson situation on Monday's episode. But when we come back, like I said at the top of the show, I want to talk about who could realistically finish last in the standings and therefore miss the postseason in the Premier Lacrosse League. So we talked about who could finish first. Now we're going to flip it and talk about who could finish last. So we'll get to that in segment 2 on the show. You're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Welcome back. Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, segment 2 of 3 on the show as we head towards the All-Star game here in the Premier Lacrosse League. Segment 1, I talked about the teams that could probably finish first in the league. Now we're going to talk about teams that could finish last in the league, and by doing so would miss out on the postseason here in 2021. So the bottom three teams are currently the Chrome and the Chaos sitting at 2-4, and the Cannons at the bottom at 2-5. So the Chrome have a -9 score differential, while the Chaos and Cannons both sit at -12. And these three teams are three teams that have been at or near the bottom of the standings for most of the year, and I don't think that that's really going to change here in these next 2 or 3 games for this team. The Chrome and the Chaos each have 3 games left. The Cannons have just 2. But I think when you look at these teams, while a team like the Atlas started at the bottom and showed improvement week to week and game by game and have now moved themselves into that top 3, top 4 of the league, these 3 teams that we're talking about now, the Chrome, Chaos, and Cannons, have really not shown a whole lot of improvement at all throughout the year. It's like at this point, they almost are who they are, and I don't think that that's going to change in the next 2 or 3 games for them. And I think for the most part, they've all sort of had up and down seasons throughout these past several weeks. When you look at a team like the Chrome, they knocked off back-to-back number 1 teams, and they're now on a 2-game losing skid, and they have to play the Atlas again post All-Star break, the first game back from the All-Star break in a week or two. And it took their offense a while to get going, and then they got held to just 6 goals against the Water Dogs in week 5, and the defense has been fine, and Galloway has had a really solid season in the cage, I think, but their problem seems to be their play on offense and the inconsistency there. For a team like the Chaos, their problems have, I think, been well documented on this show in the past several weeks. Faceoff has been a total letdown for them this season, I think, outside of 1 game by Adler back in week 4. And their offense has struggled this year, even after returning players from the travel restriction list. That was something that a lot of people were saying, hey, at least give them a chance to get some of these guys back from the travel restriction and get these guys in here and see what they can do. But offensively, they're still not very good, even with some of those guys now present in the lineup. And when you really look at this Chaos team, the defense has had to carry them for most of the season, and that includes Blaze Reardon as well, who unfortunately now finds himself on the injury list and has pulled out of the All-Star game here this weekend. So kind of a worst case scenario for this Chaos team is that you're struggling at the face-off stripe. Your offense has been wildly inconsistent this year, and now the guy that's been holding you at least above water to this point is now out with an injury, and you probably don't know how long that's going to be. And then you look at the Cannons are probably 3 plays away from their season looking totally different at this point after losing those 3 games by 1 goal each. But the fact here is that they're still 2-5, and they're still the last place team in the league. And after their win against the Archers, Lyle Thompson even said that this was their playoffs because if they don't win out, they're likely not going to make the postseason at all. So to them, this is their postseason because losing at this point is not an option. They took care of business against the Archers in week 5. They've got 2 games remaining, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, it really comes down to they cannot afford to lose another game if they want to make the postseason or even have a shot at making the postseason, because I think one more loss in these next 2 games, and that should pretty much be it for their hopes of making the playoffs. So as I said, getting to the remaining schedules for these 3 teams, and same as segment 1, I'll give my predictions as to how these teams will do in those 3 games. The Chrome have the Atlas and Chaos in week 7, and they finish up with the Cannons in week 8. For the Chrome, I think in these 3 games, I could see them going 1-2. I think they'll lose to the Atlas in that first game back from the All-Star break. And I wouldn't be surprised if they lost to the Cannons either, especially if for the Cannons that was a must-win situation, which, like I said, I think for them these next 2 games are really must-win situations. But I think especially if the Cannons have the ability to get into that 6th or 7th spot in the playoffs, that is a game that I think the Cannons will win. But you look at the Chaos. The Chaos have Chrome in week 7, then Archers and Redwoods in week 8, and that's just a really tough remaining schedule for a team like the Chaos, who have a lot of holes in their game this season, and teams like the Archers and the Redwoods especially, I think, will be able to attack some of those deficiencies. So I've got them going 1-2 here. I think that they can beat the Chrome, but I've got them losing to the Archers and the Redwoods because, like I said, I think the Archers and the Redwoods will be able to pick apart some of those matchups. They'll take advantage of some opportunities and just outplay a team like the Chaos, especially if Blaze Reardon has to miss any sort of like real time. And then the Cannons have the Atlas in week 7 and the Chrome in week 8 to round out their regular season. I've got them going 1-1 here. I think they'll lose to the Atlas and beat the Chrome. I also wouldn't be surprised if they lost, if they won against the Atlas, because the Atlas will be on their second game of the weekend in week 7. They have the Chrome to start out the week on Friday night. So I wouldn't be that surprised if the Cannons were able to pull that one out, simply because the Atlas are on their second game of the weekend, whereas that's the only game that weekend for the Cannons. So again, it's one of those situations where the Cannons could go 0-2. They could go 2-0. We just don't know. We'll have to wait and see what happens. So to the question of who finishes last here, I think if the Cannons go 2-0 and the Chrome and Chaos go 1-2, or even worse, go 0-2, 0-3, it would make 6 through 8 in the rankings very, very interesting, and I think score differential will definitely play a factor in that situation. But based on what we know, just like I said in segment 1, based on what we know, if I had to pick a team right here and right now based on this situation, I would have to go with the Chaos missing the playoffs, because with Chrome and Cannons kind of interchangeable at 6 and 7, but I got to go with the Chaos here because, like I said before, the inconsistency on offense, their inability to win faceoffs, and just putting too much pressure on that defense to hold their heads above water, and now potentially missing a guy like Blaze Reardon in the cage, just almost everything kind of working against them at this point, and I don't think they'll be able to hold it together these last 2 weeks of the regular season if that is the case. But Coach Shrek on Twitter, again, at Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter. You can hit me up there for all PLL and show-related topics and discussion, says, I think Chaos unfortunately will be the odd man out this year. Inconsistent face-off play, lackluster offense at times, and playing way too much defense. Yeah, he hits every one of the points that I just made. You have to be able to win face-offs in this league. You have to be able to play offense consistently and not turn the ball over. I mean, you go back to that game in week 5 against the Atlas. They went almost 24 minutes without a goal against their backup goalie, who's played all of, I believe, 2 or 3 quarters prior to that game. I mean, that's just, you have to be able to put up goals in that situation. Yes, the Atlas defense has been playing really well the past few games, but still, you have to be able to score goals in that situation. You have to put pressure on the Atlas defense, put pressure on JD Colarusso, and just get shots by him. And they weren't able to do that. So yeah, Shrek hits every one of my points here. Inability to win faceoffs, inconsistent offensive play, and just putting way too much pressure on Blaze Reardon in that defense. And now it's going to get harder if Blaze has to miss a game or two. But we're going to take a quick break, head into segment 3. I'll get some of your final thoughts, comments, and questions. Again, like I said, a little bit more of a mailbag this week where you guys could send me anything that you wanted me to discuss on the episode. So I'll get to a few of those to round out the show. But you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. All right, welcome back. Taking the Field with Stevie Mac, final segment of the show here as we head to the All-Star break in the PLL. I'll get to your thoughts, comments, questions here in this segment to round out the show. From Ryan on Twitter, he wanted to know the difference between Canadian and American players, style and skill. Obviously, American players grow being able to play both lefty and righty, but a lot of Canadian players only play to their strong side. He says, but doesn't seem like a disadvantage. Yeah, this is an interesting question. I wanted to get to this because I don't know a ton about box lacrosse yet. I don't know much about the quote unquote Canadian style, but I think just from looking at the PLL and seeing some of these box guys, some of these Canadian style players compared to some of the other guys in the league, I would say one thing that's really stood out to me from watching these guys and watching the PLL is they're definitely, it seems like, more comfortable in playing in tighter spaces, and especially when they draw double teams and things, when they draw slides, is that they're able to and more comfortable operating in tighter spaces, especially some of these attackmen around the crease area. They're able to maneuver and really slide in these very narrow windows and be able to make their way out in front of the cage. And so that's something to me that I think has really stood out. But like I said, I want to get more involved in the NLL here this winter. So that's definitely something that I'll be looking to, is kind of seeing the similarities and the differences between the field game and the box game. And then maybe then I'll be able to better answer this question. But again, that's just something that I noticed, is their ability to operate in tighter spaces. But yeah, he's right. You know, traditional American players have the ability to go righty or lefty when they want, whereas Canadians are more dominant hand. I'm more dominant handed, though I've never actually played box lacrosse before, so I guess I don't really fall under that category. But again, like I said, I'll definitely get more involved with the NLL this season and be better educated on the differences between field and box and that sort of thing. But Michael Ramirez says, big fan of the All-Star jerseys from 2019. Hopefully this year's doesn't disappoint. Yeah, I was actually a fan of the 2019 All-Star jerseys. I thought that the tie-dye was a nice touch. I thought it was definitely different than what we're used to seeing from most other sports all-star games, such as the MLB and things like that. I loved the idea of putting their Twitter handles on their jerseys. That was definitely unique as well. So yeah, I think the 2019 jerseys definitely set a precedent for the all-star uniforms going forward. So I hope that, given the fact that we didn't have an all-star game a year ago because of the championship series format, I hope that this year's jerseys, like Michael says, I hope they don't disappoint. Coach Shrek says, with Premier Lacrosse All-Star Game coming up this weekend, I came upon this question. Like the NHL All-Star Game, is there an extra incentive to win the game? Who is going to win the All-Star Game? So this is interesting because I don't actually know if the league has ever said, or if we will ever know if this is the case, as to whether or not the players get bonus money for making the All-Star team and appearing in the All-Star game itself. Because if I'm not mistaken, in other leagues, players actually get bonus money for making the All-Star team and participating in the game. It's kind of their incentive to actually participate in the game. So I don't know if the PLL necessarily does something like this. It's a question that's been kicked around the past few days on Twitter as to whether or not that's the case, because of the amount of players that have been opting out of the All-Star game this weekend due to injuries and things like that. Is if they aren't getting paid to participate, that's likely playing a factor. And if they're not, perhaps they should be, because then that'll entice some of them to actually be more willing to participate. Now, granted, many of those guys, as I said, have been banged up and injured, so if they don't have to play in the game, I can understand why they wouldn't want to, because they would want that extra time to be able to rest and recover and be ready to go for games that actually matter the rest of the season. But again, it's an interesting question to dive more into, and like I said, I'm not sure if the league has ever specified if players get paid extra money or not, or if they will in the future. And then he says, who is going to win the All-Star game? I can't actually answer this anymore, mainly because I'm not actually sure who's even participating in the game anymore, because like I said, the vast majority of them have now opted out because of injuries and other things. And so there's been so much shakeup that I'm not even sure the captains know who's on their team anymore, because so many guys have now been interchanged within their rosters, to where it's almost where I thought of this before the show, is that you almost wonder if they should redraft the All-Star game, because I would argue 90% of the guys that were originally part of the All-Star game a week ago are no longer there. So you almost wonder if they should redraft the All-Star game with the guys that are now going to actually be present at the game. So who's going to win? I have no idea, because I don't even know 90% of the guys that are going to be there anymore. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. You can also find the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including YouTube, Spotify, Anchor, Google, Apple Podcasts, just to name a few. We're also more recently on iHeartRadio and TuneIn as well, so you can check us out there. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.